I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zeiss Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hi everyone,
Hi,
welcome to Arcane Mark. Today we're here to talk about Megadungeons. We've had a lot of episodes that are like, what if you want to do a big social thing? What if you want to do like infiltrations or chases or other complicated subsystems? And you can do all of those things in a Megadungeon, but sometimes you want a campaign where it's just like, this is a gigantic dungeon. It has multiple floors, different subsections, each with different themes perhaps, or maybe it's all the same theme and it's just enormous. And there's so much going on in this gigantic location that it can cover much of, if not all of, the entire campaign.
Yeah. So when you're thinking about creating a mega dungeon, one of the things that you want to think about is, what is the structure for? What is the goal that the PCs are going to? Is it going to be one of those things where the PCs need to collect something on every floor to gather them together for the bottom? Or is it going to be like, this is a place that seals something away? Or, is it a place that they're going to explore that's been abandoned for a long time and they're not sure what they're going to find?
Right. You want to know what it is and what the PC's motivation is, because those can be different. Like, it's a place that seals something horrible, and if you go down, that thing will get freed. Can still have the PC's motivation be, there might be treasure down there. Mm-hmm. And the sort of failure of those two things to match up can lead to twists and turns down the way, because the PCs don't necessarily know. Now, that can be true for any dungeon, that there's something sealed down, or whether the PCs have certain motivation. So let's talk about, and I gave it briefly in the introduction, but let's talk about what is the boundary line. What makes something a mega dungeon?
A mega dungeon is going to be something that...
And not just like a bigger dungeon.
It's going to be something that is going to take a lot of sessions to go through. It has multiple stages and sections that are likely going to have multiple stages and sections that are distinct from each other thematically. And if not thematically, then in terms of difficulty. Likely, because in a lot of cases, unless you're saying like, oh, we're going to stay the same level, by the time you conquer a mega dungeon, you're going to have leveled up several times.
So if you had a dungeon with 200 combat encounters, and where like they were actually all roughly the same difficulty somehow, and you were playing with like milestone experience, or maybe just the PCs got stronger near the end and the fights were a little easier, and you were playing with a very slow experience, would you say that wasn't a mega dungeon?
No, it is, but I was saying, unless you're doing something artificially to stop your ability to level up, like, you're probably going to have different zones that are designed for different level characters, and you'll need some mechanism of ensuring that the PCs don't bumble into the spaces that are going to be too dangerous for them, because they're going to be very close to each other in proximity. And this also has a lot to do with the different creatures that you have there as well, thinking about how they interact. If you have a system where the fact that the PCs are fighting against level 1 creatures on floor 1 is going to mean that, the level 20 creature down on floor 20 is going to be like, oh, I'm going to come up and attack. Like, that's an issue. So, like, you want to make sure that the dungeon ultimately responds to the presence of the PCs, but there's some kind of reason why the whole dungeon's not coming up to attack them. And usually with mega dungeons, I mean, it's cool to have them in regular dungeons too, but mega dungeons do well with having different factions within them. Whether they are different groups that are competing for territory, or, some of them may not, the big powerful one may not care about the creatures that are living in the walls or that kind of thing. And then you're also going to have some that don't have a motivation necessarily other than like food. Because it's like, oh, there's an ooze here. It just eats. Or there's like an ancient guardian construct. Its motivation is smash anyone who comes into the room.
So what would you say is around the cutoff where you're like, no, now this is a mega dungeon? Because I've seen just regular dungeons in certain adventures. Like, I feel like the dungeon in Flood Season from Shackled City had like 80 rooms or something like that. And it was not a mega dungeon. It was one dungeon with like one purpose, and you just went through, I can't remember exactly how many it had, but it had a lot. I'm actually looking it up now because I want to.
You want to see how big it was?
I want to remind myself how many rooms that it had. And I would say it was definitely not a mega dungeon. Is there a certain point where a room number makes something a mega dungeon, or is it more a matter of philosophy and like how long it takes to get through it that makes something a mega dungeon? Okay, it was only 56, so it was not 80. Some of them were big.
Yeah, I tend to think of it as having to do also with like the number of regions or levels that are within it. So, like, if you have a massive castle that has many levels to it, and also like sub basements or things like that, and then it goes into the Undercity, and then you have these other things that are going on with it. Or like, if you have a dungeon that's like, oh yeah, this is an entire sprawling ancient ruin. Like, but there's also some element of encounter areas, because if you said, hey, we're gonna do an exploration in an abandoned city, but there's only like 10 locations of note, like that doesn't feel like a mega dungeon to me. It really, to me, is like, this is like an entire large adventure or mini campaign. This is something that you're gonna be playing for like, and jamming for like 5 or more sessions. You got like 20 hours of gameplay or something like that. You're gonna keep going back into it. You're probably gonna want to have like you're going to have to consider, it's going to be long enough that you need to consider things like, what is the PC's base of operations, and like how are they going to do downtime in this area, because you really need to like break it up to get more resources and things like that.
I think that's how I would define it too, is that it becomes a mega dungeon when it's important enough to your campaign that it is like more than just one story. It's more than just like a module. It's like it's going to be multiple adventures in there, or an entire campaign.
Yeah.
And that could mean that you could have a mega dungeon that actually does not have even, like, you could have something that's a mega dungeon with 56 areas, like that Flood Season dungeon. But in that case, the areas are probably a lot more expansive and complicated, and the amount of time it takes to get through them and to deal with them is probably longer than the average dungeon room in a typical dungeon. So once you know that you want a mega dungeon because of scope, and then you know what was the purpose this mega dungeon was built, who lives there, and are there different factions?
Also, who lived there before? Because when you say like who lives there, it's also who lived there, because it's important.
And that's part of the purpose of why it was built. But yes, why was it built? Who lives there now? Were there any like custody changes, even in between, in the middle, where it's like it was built to contain this demon at the bottom, and then there was a whole civilization that lived in this dungeon for a while. Now they're gone too, and they didn't even know about the demon, and now there's a bunch of these other things.
Yeah, well, it works well. I mean, it's a classic trope to have like people who live in the mega dungeon but aren't aware of all of its secrets, or can't get through all of its secrets because there's some kind of a trap that they can't make it past, or some kind of an activation key that they don't have.
Right.
And that's really useful too, because then you have, there's treasure that is findable in ways that aren't interacting with the people who are directly there, and there's also mysteries that no matter how much you talk to people, you're not going to be able to find out everything.
Absolutely. So you want to know the history of the dungeon, the factions, who lives there, and also why the PCs are interested in the dungeon. And it may just be as simple as, look guys, I made a mega dungeon, come up with the reason that you want to go to the mega dungeon, please. That is acceptable. It doesn't have to be some complex thing like, my father was killed by a wandering mega dungeon one day, and I've been chasing down this mega dungeon for years until I found it here in this mega dungeon.
Yeah, I mean, it could be simple motivations like, maybe there's a prize for whoever's the first to reach the bottom, or maybe, like, there's a legendary treasure that the PCs need. It's fame, it's fortune, it's, it's like, maybe they'll rank up in the Adventurers Guild if they
you could just
are the
have
first
a
people to get there.
Very lit RPG style, just, it's a dungeon, everybody does the dungeon. You could have, like, our family have been custodians and explorers of this dungeon for generations. Someday we must reach the bottom.
Or it could be, the dungeon and its surrounding environment were stable, and then something happened. Like, oh yeah, and then suddenly miasma started creeping out from the dungeon into the surrounding area, and people realized their old wards weren't working, and someone needs to go in there and figure out what changed. But people who live in an area around a dungeon are probably going to have experience and information about what's going on there, even if it's just like nobody goes over there, it's too dangerous, but they'll have legends about what happened in the past.
That's right. A lot of people are talking about the background for our new temporary location.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it is the library in Linda's parents' house.
Yes.
So, when you're thinking about a mega dungeon, Linda was talking about the people who live nearby. Think about the location of it. Is it a lonely mountain somewhere far away from civilization, or is there a village or town that's right nearby to the dungeon? There can be some benefits to having a settlement that's nearby because it can allow you to change your pace. Just because your group has signed up for a mega dungeon campaign doesn't necessarily mean that all they want to see is the dungeon all the time. Going back to town and having mini adventures up there with, like, maybe the Thieves Guild wants to steal something that the party has just brought back up out of town, or out of the dungeon to the town, or like an interfering noble is trying to take over their expedition or steal the credit for it, or even just like it's a positive thing and they're trying to get patronage and more funding for their expedition.
Or maybe they need another item, or they need information, like they found weird things in the dungeon and they're not sure what they mean.
They need a scholar who can read it.
They need a scholar to read it, or they're going to do like a research thing, or like they realize that, you know, this dungeon, they're going to require some kind of a special key to progress further, and that's something that they need to go find, or that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you can have this settlement that provides a change of pace, and it can also be a change of sort of like the ambience and the sort of the feel and the theme of the game, because like maybe the mega dungeon is like really dangerous and really scary, but then back in town you can have more of a feeling of safety. Or maybe vice versa. Maybe like the mega dungeon is kind of goofy because some weird wizard made it and it's constantly attacking you with puns, but like when you get to the surface, like weirdly enough, like the backstabbing political factionism of the humans are like the real horror.
Yes.
And like it's more whimsical when you're in the mega dungeon. There's a lot of different possibilities where you can use them as foils, and the gap between the two can allow the PCs to take a breather or to experience a shift in the theme and feel of the game. So there were some questions from Sheppy as a question about in Mega Dungeons, how do you deal with having many encounters, which could take a lot of time, because Sheppy loves running Mega Dungeon, but Sheppy's players don't because of the amount of time the encounters can take.
I would say that you know, even if you're running like a published adventure, sometimes you'll look at them and you'll be like, oh, you know, there's these 5 encounters that seem pretty similar to each other or whatever. With my home group, things that we've done include, you know, combining some of them into a somewhat harder encounter and having like doing that and then deleting some of the other ones out. If encounters, and then you can have ones that are very easy, ones that are trivial encounters, and, you know, maybe you play that out once and we're like, yep, you know how to beat those guys, so like you encountered another group of them, and like we're not going to play that out. Or
you can do a Matt Mercer on those and be like, how do you want to do this? And just ask people how they defeated this easy group that they've already fought before multiple times.
Yeah. Intersperse the encounters with skill challenges, you know, social challenges, sneaking, you know. You can handle defeating some opponents with victory points as well, instead of direct combat, particularly if they are something that is like pretty easy and you just kind of want to be like, yeah, there's a lot of really easy opponents here. We don't want to play out all those combats. We're just going to be like,
imagine that you have a demon tunnel that are full of weaker demons, and their encounters that like maybe would have taken some time, but nobody wants to do all of it. And there's like the Demon King is in the center, and she is ready to fight the PCs, is very strong, and wants to gather forces. So you could use a victory point subsystem for the demon extermination of the weaker demons to see, based on your victory points, how many forces make it to the Demon King, and like also how prepared she is based on how long you take and how well you exterminate certain sections, and be like, well, you know, you beat the pits of greed, and so therefore like the greed lieutenant isn't there, and the Demon King loses like the avarice buff that she would have. And so the final encounter, the actual combat encounter that you run, is this giant set piece demon battle that has multiple factors that can be changed by the victory point system, where you were theoretically exterminating demons, but you didn't want to run it because it was essentially like 100 to 200 battles that the PCs were doing with easier demons.
Another thing to consider doing for that is that using troops, is a good way to get across the feel of there are a lot of people here without doing a lot of encounters. So if you find yourself, you're looking at this and you're like, yeah, this floor has 10 different encounters with guards. My players aren't going to want to play that out. Then switching that into, there's one encounter that has troops of weaker guards and a lieutenant, and then there's another encounter that has, like, some different powerful guards or what have you. And that's like, well, they've still fought the dozens of guards, but they've done it in a different form factor.
That's right. So Sheppy points out getting FOMO when preparing an adventure, not to skip anything because it could be fun, but then the quirk of published adventures that many encounters can sometimes be thrown in to fill space. So no, this is an issue. Mm-hmm. And it's not because the adventure authors don't know how to write more unique encounters. I've talked about this before where, honestly, adventure authors run out of space.
Yes.
And they have to get a certain amount of XP sometimes to get people up the appropriate amount of levels. And so they have to reuse creatures. I talked about how when I was running a certain, kind of Megadungeon, because it was almost the whole part of an AP in Jade Regent, you can decide whether it was a very big regular dungeon or a very small Megadungeon. It had several different floors. There are these 2 stock hobgoblin stat blocks, and they were everywhere. They were pretty similar to each other. They were very simple. They weren't spellcasters. They didn't take much space. And they were constantly reused in very interesting rooms with good setups that could have been interesting fights. But the problem was that the creatures didn't have much they could do, and they couldn't take a great advantage of their setup, and they were the same ones. So simply by adding a bard and an oracle that I used in every encounter, it was like, well, there's the fighter rogues and the fighters. But then I was like, okay, but I'm going to replace one with an oracle and one with a bard in each group. Mm-hmm. And that drastically changed it so that all of the setup that had been done by the author to make interesting rooms with, like, walls that they'd set up with arrow slits and, like, other different things going on, with the bard and the oracle, they could take advantage of that.
Yeah.
Because they were able to heal, they were able to dispel magic, they were able to buff, and when the party did magic, it wasn't just like a hard counter to the opponents. So by making those small changes to the encounters and adding a little bit more, people were interested, and every time it was something new. Mm-hmm. And that was an example where clearly the author and developer knew how to make the dungeon have interesting rooms with good setups, but the word count was a harsh mistress in there. Obviously wasn't enough word count to create a whole bunch more hobgoblin stat blocks to put in there.
So when you're looking at those kinds of things, making some variants, and then once you have those, you can customize them more. Like maybe you have your oracle, but some of the oracles, you have oracles, and some of the oracles have different spells than others, or like some of the rogues are built to kind of be themed after a different racket or what have you. So you can use a lot of the same baseline stats and just change out. The things that are the primary actions that the NPCs take on their rounds are the things that are flashy. Like, players aren't going to notice as much, like, oh, yeah, sure, like, everything in this encounter has 180 hit points. Like, they're not going to notice that as much as everything in this encounter does the same attack routine.
Correct. And that's the thing. Like, I'm not going to say every published adventure always was full of authors that were, like, full of creativity and always only stymied by word count. Obviously, there's many possibilities, but I can tell, because it'll be awesome, great descriptions, a huge setup for, like, an interesting encounter, and be like, oh, but it's the same creatures again. So ultimately, they're going to do the same things. And that's when I know, yeah, they had ideas. They just didn't have words to put them in. And you, as the GM, you have as many words as you want. Mm-hmm. And, like Linda said, you don't always have to make a whole oracle or a bard, especially since what I was doing was in Pathfinder 1. In Pathfinder 2, you could just make a really thematic special ability that was otherwise on mostly the same hobgoblin stat block, where it'd be like, yeah, well, these ones are behind the wall. They have some cool action where they, like, make spikes shoot out of the wall on these wall engineers that otherwise have most of the same stats. And then there's this other group that can do, like enfilading archery through the arrow slits, and that otherwise have similar stats. And that makes it easier in PF2 if you're dealing with a situation like that where they ran out of space to make things that are different and that can take advantage of the unique area. Now, if you find in the dungeon there aren't unique rooms either, and they're the same creatures over and over again, well, you could make the rooms empty. Like we said before, you could turn it into victory points or just narration of how do you want to do this. or you can replace it with a totally different encounter. You've got lots of options depending on what your group likes, the pacing you're going for, and you can even leave yourself the possibility to do it based on like the timing of the session.
Yeah, you can totally say, okay, yeah, you know, this room I know is going to have this kind of treasure, and there's this creature who is somewhere in the mega dungeon, and they could either be in this room or maybe there's not much time in the session, so the PCs will find them in another place that they like to rest.
Mm-hmm. And you can, like, in PF2, it's very easy to spice something up, even if they didn't give you, let's say they didn't give you that interesting of a room. It just got the same creatures that are in it as before, but you did want to keep an encounter, and you didn't necessarily have time or the inclination to make a whole new creature. You could just make something up. Like, you can be like, well, you know what, this hobgoblin got possessed by a banshee. It has, like, a giant scream ability. And like, maybe there's a history of a banshee in the dungeon. Maybe there wasn't, and you just made that up, and you're just like, yeah, there was one. And it melded into this hobgoblin.
And also, since a lot of maps are just going to show you, like, major features and outlines of the room, there's a lot of potential to add hazards into pretty much any room.
Complex hazards, simple hazards, other weird special effects of the area. Anything that will lead to the players doing something interesting that isn't just beating the crap out of things will always let the players, not only can they potentially be more engaged, it can shake them up out of a rut of what they were doing before, and usually it makes more of the players feel like superstars, because when you have a combat, there's only going to be like a certain number of people who feel like they did the clinch thing in the fight, unless things go really well and it's just, oh yeah, I saved you from that attack and I blew that thing up and then I got the final kill. That might happen. But when you have, like, the ceiling is falling on you and that is making the bats upset and now they're swarming, and you have the one person who's like, I calmed down the bats, I fixed the ceiling, I killed the ooze. It's almost guaranteed that there's going to be 3 different people that almost every time are going to feel like, yes, this is great. Like when Linda wrote the Rose Street Revenge, one of the little mini adventures for those demos for PF2, for the playtest, it literally had
that
those
was what
3
it was,
things.
yeah.
And I ran that at Origins dozens of times. And it was someone different who did those 3 accomplishments virtually every time. It was 3 different people, and they all were like, yes, because they felt like they really contributed a lot to what was happening with the group. One time, it was like a little girl was playing Kyra, and she befriended the bats with her critical success on the bats. So I said one of the bats was like resting on Kyra's headdress.
Aw. So yeah, think about up too when you're looking at a map. How tall is the room? Because the ceiling height, once you start thinking maybe this room is really tall, then maybe you're going to start thinking, okay, well, does that mean that there is a creature that's climbing on the ceiling? Does that mean that there's, like, higher platforms? Does that mean that there's archers? Does that mean that there's other things like that? Because, you know, if you stick to the 10-foot ceilings, then you definitely lose out on some of the possibilities.
That's
but
right.
having that kind of variety, having, like, some narrow places where you're really kind of squeezing through, and then large, big rooms, because those make a big difference in the kinds of tactics that you can do. I mean, we often advise for maps, you know, don't make something that's so small that it's hard for folks to squeeze into. But if you're doing a mega dungeon, having things that are like choke points and difficult is valuable sometimes, so you have that kind of variety.
Especially if the denizens can get through it and your group has to go around. It can lead to some interesting situations. Or vice versa. The denizens may be large, so large they can't fit through, but your group can take shortcuts. And so there's a lot of fun things you can do. When it comes to modding an area based on a theme, you could consider what ways you can do that. For example, if you're building the mega dungeon yourself, let's say you wanted an area with strange, out of control elemental energies, and like the floors were themed after different elements. Well, with the Eldamon book that I've been writing for Roll for Combat, there's a huge number of different elemental powers, and there's a section in there in one of the chapters that's just like, yeah, you can just like throw one of these powers onto a creature to give it more of an elemental theme. So you can just take monsters from Bestiary and give them all like one of the fire elemental powers for a fire floor, and like also a more fiery appearance, maybe the some resistance to or immunity to fire and weaknesses to cold or something.
Yeah,
like
absolutely. I mean that's a good general tip is to don't be afraid to make a slight tweak and reskin the appearance of a creature. The same stat block can work for a lot of different things.
You can just suddenly have a very thematic floor, or you can have like the wood element, which is constantly making difficult terrain and like sowing plants and then harvesting them. Like by the time your PCs are finished with that floor, they will get the gimmick, and all having all these different creatures that have that in common would allow you to just kind of use a bunch of different, even randomly selected creatures from a bestiary that you just added that to, and you can think like, wait, how's this gibbering mouther wood? Oh, well, maybe it's full of like spores and like plants and flowers inside of the gibbering mouther too.
Yeah. And then consider how the rewards can match with the theme. Both in terms of like, treasures that the PCs find, as well as access to different options, whether that's, that they found a recipe hidden in a lost archive, or that they interacted with someone. Because in your mega dungeons, in almost every case, you're not going to want to just have a mega dungeon where people are just everything in there is something that you attack. You're going to want to have
just filled with battles in every room.
You're going to want to have people that the PCs can talk to, And this doesn't just mean like, oh yes, you rescued these people, but it's more interesting when there are choices and the PCs are like, well, do we want to ally with this group? If we ally with this group, how do we, how long do we want that alliance to last? And is there a point in which they might cross the line? And we're like, yeah, no.
Yeah, so you want to have different things to vary things up. So going back to when we were talking about different splits in the Mega Dungeon, part of it can be, okay, this is the higher levels section. Part of it can be, okay, we've done one of the arcs. But one of the parts of it is it shakes things up. If all of the Mega Dungeon is the same theme, your group might get bored or tired of that theme. But if you split things up into different sections that have a different theme, into different types of encounters where you have, oh, this is the crumbling library with lore and we need to do a research. Oh, this is a place that's like a gauntlet full of hazards. Oh, this is a place where a very powerful monster that came up from a higher floor is chasing us, and we have to do a chase scene.
You're going to want to vary up the density of danger, everything from, like, places that eventually become totally safe to rest to places where you're, like, running away from something that is super powerful that you can't necessarily fight directly.
That's right. And that will make it feel a lot less repetitive. You can have something that's a mega dungeon that is just full of different experiences and that feels like it's covering a large number of different like pillars of gameplay. One adventure path that I thought did pretty well with this was Shattered Star. At least if your group goes into it thinking that you want to like weirdly socially interact with a bunch of evil things to trick them in order to not have difficult fights, there's a lot that you can do. Even some of the sections that are like really evil have these like complicated alliances that have holes in them that can figure out. Yeah, if your group wants to try to like scam the NPCs and turn some of them against each other. So with Mega Dungeons, it's always cool to know, like Linda said, who's in there, what the sections are in terms of maybe the floors or sections of the dungeon geographically, in terms of politically, because you could have a faction that is on a bunch of different floors for some reason. Like, let's say it's the releasing the demon that's at the bottom faction. And most people don't know there is a demon at the bottom, but there is a faction that's trying to release the demon at the bottom, and there's different nodes. They're in the different sections, and they're trying to get to them everywhere, but the sections are ruled by not that faction in most cases. And so there's maybe one that faction rules, and that their node has already been activated, and it's maybe close to the prison of the demons, so that if they get all the other ones, they can just welcome their lord and master into the light. But that could be one that like the PCs are like, look, evil group that is tyrannically subjugating this area. You don't want the demon people to like release this demon either, because the demon will crush you and your tyrannical.
And of course, they're PCs, so empire. Sometimes they take their agreements seriously, and sometimes they backstab the people that they allied with as soon as they're done, because they're like, they're evil.
Thanks for helping us stop the demon. Now your tyrannical empire must fall.
Yes.
Yep.
But that's totally their choice.
That's right. And the Tyrannical Empire may have their own plans to make sure that that doesn't happen by double-crossing the PCs first.
Yes. Wait a minute. It's like, you're backstabbing me? Wait, I was going to backstab you.
You. Yeah, so basically, just because it's a dungeon doesn't mean it can't be a microcosm of an entire campaign.
Yeah, I mean, dungeons could have, like, when you talk about a safe area between it could be, like, a protected room that they're able to activate ancient warns in, or it could be, you know, there's legit, like, a settlement inside this mega dungeon that the PCs could spend time in if they reach it.
Yep. It could be, like, a dungeon city that is on a certain floor within the dungeon where a bunch of denizens come to trade things that they found in the dungeon. Not just always on the surface. It could be in the middle of the dungeon.
Yeah, the dungeon's big enough.
Yep.
And, you know, thinking about tropes from light novels and things like that, the idea of, like, dungeon floors where you can always warp back to the top and you can go down as far as you've been before, but you can't go down farther. Like, I think that would be an interesting one for one in an RPG if you were trying to delve farther, because
respawning chests.
Yes, how to get back places that you've been before and how to traverse the area. But it can also be interesting when you can't always go back right away. Like maybe to get to one place you had to get in a boat and go over a waterfall, and now you have to like figure out a way to get back to where you were before, and that can create some amount of a pressure of like, oh, how are we going to be able to escape after this point? Which helps vary out the pacing too, because you have when you have a dungeon that you can just leave at any time, you know, there could be a situation where the PCs are like, oh yeah, we're gonna do one encounter and then we're gonna leave and then we're gonna come back and things like that. Whereas that doesn't work so well with mega dungeons, because it's gonna take you forever if people keep coming back. So having some kind of reason for them to keep going longer, whether that's, you know, like time pressure in terms of, if we don't discover this quickly enough, you know, something bad will happen, or someone else will come in and get the treasure, or like the people, the factions within will have more time to respond and things will only get more difficult from here. Things like that.
That's right. Kojo is wondering if the dwarf city of Highhelm is a type of mega dungeon. I feel like any Sky City, especially if there's sections that you would treat more as a dungeon than a city because of like monster infestations or attacks or things like that, is going to be big enough to serve as a mega dungeon. And certainly even an active dwarven Sky City full of dwarves could be a mega dungeon for enemies of dwarves who are like, oh, we have to defeat these dangerous dwarves who keep attacking us. Mm-hmm. So,
it's more about the density of danger that makes it feel more like a dungeon. So that's why I tend to think of more of like a ruined or abandoned city, or like a place that is, you know, if not entirely monsters, at least like most of the creatures that live there are more likely to attack you than they are to try to have a conversation.
That's right. I think that's probably fair. Like if it's generally just peachy, then it may not be a mega dungeon. Or even if it has dangerous creatures like, I don't know, a city in Geb is probably not a mega dungeon, even though it's full of undead.
Because there's that sense of social contract of, you know, you're not just gonna need to worry about being attacked in any random room that you go to. And there's also not
quick.
Well, there's also not a sense of like, this is a thing that we will finish and defeat.
Yes, it's
like
not like we're going to destroy this entire city.
Yeah, like I guess you could if it were like less ridiculously powerful, you know, having a settlement where it's like, oh yeah, and now we're going to defeat. But then that also gets into like the numbers, right? Like you don't want a dungeon where you have to fight like 10,000 creatures or something like that. Even if you brought them into troops,
50,000 creatures, and we have no allies except for these weird Pharasman clerics who are like, yeah, go for it, guys.
Yes, as Kojo said, we're in a city with civilization and society. Please keep the murdering to a minimum.
So you can definitely have that. You could even have dungeons where like there's signs that are like, please keep the murdering to a minimum, because some wacky wizard like created it. And is like, come on, everybody. We're I know we have a dungeon here, but we're trying to run a business, and monsters like punch out, like they're like, okay, I finished my shift, and then they go back to like the dungeon city at the bottom of the dungeon.
Non-lethal only, please. Now I'm just thinking of a training dungeon.
Or where they just, like, have agreements with, like, the local adventurers. It's like, come on, you guys, only send in lower-level adventurers here. You know the monsters can't handle these really high-level adventurers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, let's see.
So I think that we've covered a lot of the most important facts about Megadungeon, which is that you have to know the reason that the PCs are going in, the reason it was built, the history, the sections geographically and politically. And once you have those, it kind of can start running itself once you start fleshing it out. So
yeah, know with your sections what level you're going to expect the PCs to be at when they reach various sections, and how you're going to physically divide those sections out if there is a wide level disparity, so you don't have to worry about TPK potential.
That's true. Where it's like, yeah, you went in at first level, on the 25th level, dragon ate you.
Mm-hmm. Or even
End
just
of
like,
the dungeon.
Even if it's just like, oh yeah, it's not clear that you shouldn't go down the staircase yet. Like,
oh, you went down that staircase?
Oops.
You got eaten by Tree Razor. He lives there. You should have noticed by all of his, like, creepy poetry that he had written on the wall about wanting to burn down trees and being mad that his daddy banished him from the abyss. But you didn't. And so you got eaten by Tree Razor at level 1. So, yeah, you want to make sure that there's some, that if there are some, like, really nasty things that make it dungeon, they at least feel fair, unless you're playing in a, like, very OSR style or old school style, where it's like, no, yeah, the capriciousness of not feeling fair is kind of...
It's kind
like,
of part of the deal, yeah.
Where it's just like, oops, well, make another character, and it only takes 5 seconds.
Well, we've talked before about some of the strategies you can use to signpost that some area is very dangerous, like the remains of those who came before, or like, having found information before, like being sealed off behind something that looks like a complex ward that is not supposed to be broken, and being able to run things as like that opponent is just toying with the PCs and they've got a skill challenge to run away and escape with their lives because they're not even trying to fight or win.
Yeah, and to be fair, some groups, even with more RPGs, more complex character creation, like the Capricious Sudden Death, and some groups, even that are playing more old school, don't like it. So, like, if your group wants to have that, you can, but we usually recommend not to put in Capricious Sudden Death into your situation. If they can die, it wants to feel like, I made my choice. Or, yeah, I knew that that might be what I was getting into, rather than just like, what?
Yeah. There's a question. Do you guys think the lore of the Megadungeon is a hidden plot or trying to survive? For me, I tend to be more interested in the evolution of the hidden plot and coming to understand the complex ecosystem. Though I definitely have enjoyed doing some, like, Tomb of Horrors type stuff in the past.
And some people enjoy just the emergent story from a big mega dungeon, even if it doesn't have a hidden plot. That is just like, yeah, the GM was just kind of randomly building this. They didn't think about the factions in advance. They just wanted to put cool monsters in there. And sometimes the PCs just make their own thing, where they're just like, they just come up with a weird idea. It's like, oh yeah, we'll just like keep cutting off Hydra heads and sell it at a restaurant or something like that. And just like things that you wouldn't predict and that just create their own story. So a Mega Dungeon is the kind of epitome of site-based adventure.
Yes.
Where it's like, okay, your adventure varies in space. Whereas there are also adventures that are more of time-based adventures, where it's like, okay, as certain time passes, things are going to happen, NPCs have plots, mysteries that have potentially multiple murders or things like that. Could be a very time-based adventure. And so with a Mega Dungeon, you can do, and you can tell all sorts of stories, but ultimately the site is kind of the star of the show. Yeah.
And in terms of trying to survive, if you're running for that, the fact that Mega Dungeons do take place in such a enclosed space, relatively speaking, and if you can't leave once you've entered, and they're definitely a place if your group is interested in doing adventures with very limited resources and like heavy time pressure and things like that, where you can't go back to town for a long time, or you can't restock and you have to make do with what you have.
Yep, you can also tell stories about pressing your luck, where it's like, well,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if we have enough resources, but we can go down further if we
Mm-hmm.
just keep going now and we don't turn
Do the
back.
PCs have like a limited number of times that they can escape?
Yeah, or is it too dangerous to rest in the dungeon?
Mm-hmm.
And so they either have to retreat all the way back, or they have to keep going without resting for a little while longer.
Mm-hmm.
Is that if you don't have like convenient teleporters or convenient safe
Mm-hmm.
locations to rest, that leads to a definite push and pull for the mega dungeon.
Yeah, and what happens to areas when the PCs have left them for a little while? If they go out to go to a safe camp and they decide to rest for a full day and they come back, like if creatures from deeper in the dungeon come and settle things, you know, at the very least, whatever loot they left behind is probably not still there if there's other creatures on
And
the
that's
floor.
after one day.
Yeah.
What about they've been doing a different section of the dungeon for a while and they come back like a month later? You know, nature abhors a vacuum.
Yes.
So has something else found this really nice looking area that could be a great lair and is now setting up camp there? Like, what's the situation? Most PCs don't bring infrastructure with them to fill that vacuum. Some do. Maybe they are doing something.
Maybe they don't the first time, and then later on they realize, okay, yeah, we need to stock up on our stuff and make sure that we have these kinds of supplies. Or maybe they're gonna take spells specifically for the or rituals specifically for the purpose of creating temporary safe zones.
Mm-hmm. And so maybe also things changed because there was a tenuous, balance of power among certain factions, and the PCs wipe out one of the factions. And how does that change things? Or they kill we want to release the demon faction, but maybe that faction was doing certain things, like they were like signing up as evil viziers for certain other factions so they could try to get to the node to release the demon. Or maybe there's like a three-way battle for power, and the PCs kick out one of the legs on that tripod. What happens? Do the other two go into all-out war to try to take control? Do they, even though they hate each other, team up because the PCs killed one, and the other two could fall next if they don't want to work together? And are the PCs going to try to influence that by secretly infiltrating the factions and stoking them against each other? Just like... There's so many different things that can happen in a mega dungeon that aren't just fight after fate.
Yeah. And another thing to consider too when you're talking about like the layout of it is it's cool to have secret passages and doors, especially, you know, ones that will help you get back. Either they'll help you get back to where you started quickly, or they might let you like infiltrate and ambush. And then thinking about where are those,
might be a shortcut for later on.
Be a shortcut for later on that you can use, exactly. Sheppy was talking about so folks are talking about like static dungeons versus active dungeons. Garland was talking about really liking the organically changing ones. And then Chevy was talking about managing active dungeons to make sure the players don't get frustrated when more monsters appear. I would say that generally, like, if you're refilling an area, you wouldn't, like, refill it back to as full as it was before. It might be, like, something that is smaller or something that is more different. Or, like, it's been a really long time since they've been there, so it's like, oh, yeah. Or it is, you know... something that's clearly from deeper in. So it's like, well, you know, you may be fighting in similar areas, but you are fighting what you would have had to fight on the later floors.
Right. Like, there is a ground between, Sheppy and Garland in the chat when they had this disagreement about active dungeons making some players frustrated, or maybe they don't even disagree with each other in principle, but Garland saying it's unrealistic that it frees frames and feels artificial. Well, you know, things getting harder is not the only way that the dungeon can react to the PC's presence. Maybe the PCs blitz in, kill a bunch of creatures from a single faction, then leave, and then
the remainder
rest
of the faction
is
flees.
like, heck no, and they take their best treasure and they run. And so the PCs find, actually, this whole place is cleared now. We didn't lose progress. We actually... we only defeated 5 out of the 20 rooms full of this type of creature, but actually all 20 are vacant now. We can move on to the next region.
Yes.
And so, like, that there was an opportunity cost and that the treasure is gone too, but, you know, the PCs are still the level that they were before. They'll probably get an equal amount of treasure in a different way, in a different place when they're leveling up. Ironically... the worst thing that you can have in terms of, like, your wealth compared to your level, and even then in Pathfinder 2 at least with the exponential wealth curve, it just fixes itself over time. Is if you get lots of XP but then don't get the treasure, then you level up while you don't have the treasure that was expected. But since you didn't get the treasure or the XP for those creatures, then there could just be other creatures and other encounters that give you the treasure and
if that
later.
does happen a lot in your dungeon where, like, you know, the PCs are like, there's too much around and they can't necessarily loot, and then the treasure gets, like, taken by, you know, having it be taken by another creature in the dungeon and stored away somewhere where they can later get it, and it's like, ah, yeah, there it is, rather than, like, having the sense of, like, oh man, we permanently missed out on it.
That's right. And it doesn't have to be just totally empty in a ghost town either. They could, like, set traps.
Yes.
Or just be like, okay, these monsters came into our place. They killed 25% of our population within, like, 9 minutes. They seem to be checking on some 10-minute timer for some reason.
Yes.
And then, as soon as that was done, they left. And so, like, maybe it's just like, we've got to get out of here. But also, even if we flee, they might find us. So maybe they set a trap to try to collapse a part of their old homes, hoping that it'll take these intruders with them.
Yes.
It'd be like, just, yeah, well, we'll go, in our old treasure vault, we'll just, like, set it to, like, collapse the whole thing on them. And maybe now there's traps there instead of fights. It'll be done more quickly. PCs won't feel like it's just like a treadmill where every time they leave, that they always have to fight encounters in the same room again because it's always filled with monsters that are suspiciously the same level as them. It's like, well, yeah, wow, we cleared those other 15 rooms quickly, but, you know, at a cost, and looks like they were desperate to get rid of us.
Or it may be, you know, if it's, like, on a floor and some of the creatures were, like, in farther flung areas of the floor, and then when the PCs come back, they've gone to a more defensible area. So they're having another encounter in that same area, but with different creatures that are the ones that were elsewhere on the floor, and then they can see signs as they explore. Oh, yeah, they were in those other rooms before, and now they've all, like, bunkered down because of the PCs.
Right, or maybe everyone there retreated down a little bit further, and the PCs will find them, but only after they level up a few times, at which point fighting all those encounters together is actually maybe a reasonable fight.
Yes.
Whereas before, they would have needed to fight them separately, or it would have been too hard for the PCs. So there's a lot of ways to play around with leveling dynamics and the dungeon to have those come back later and be like, oh, okay, yeah, we're just going to fight them all at once.
This point,
It'll be still a severe encounter, but it would have been just absurd to fight it all.
Or, you know,
before.
if the PCs are resting in the dungeon, maybe they'll fight some of them under less favorable circumstances if they, like, get attacked and things like that.
Yep.
Because PCs may, you know, there's ground between, like, this is definitely a hallowed sanctuary of this deity that will keep us safe, and, like, this is definitely not dangerous. There's places where they might be like, oh, you know, we'll rest here, we'll keep watch, and things like that. And if the PCs are resting in a dungeon, thinking about what happens overnight, and do they run across anyone while they're doing that?
Right. And you can have either random encounter tables or come up with it on your own. Let's say there's one faction, I don't know, we'll say it's Zul'Gath, that are just like, these PCs are now our boogeyman. They killed 25% of us. We'll be telling stories about them for generations, if we even have generations. And maybe there are random encounters with Zul'Gath that are rolled, and when it happens, the Zul'Gath, like, come around the corner, they see the PCs, they're like, ah! And then they just run.
Yes.
They're like, they don't want to fight anymore. They're just like, these creatures, these scaleless creatures are terrifying.
Yes.
And they're just gonna kill us.
Yeah.
And so that can be part of a consequence. The PCs get to feel defective. Their notoriety is just like all the Zul'Gath random encounters have heard of them too now, because
they run away.
Their cousins retreated back to the larger Zul'Gath settlement and just like, watch out, these things are going to kill all of you. But you know, maybe like there's a would be priest monarch of the Zul'Gath who is like, I can take control of all the Zul'Gath here if I can take down their greatest fear.
Their greatest fear,
the phantoms, the scaleless phantoms who killed all of the other ones on the upper floor. And so maybe they send a war band specifically after the PCs. So you can come up with consequences that aren't just that things fill up right away with another encounter in the same rooms. And so I think that's one way to go about it.
Yes. Alrighty.
Okay, so I think we've covered some good ideas for Megadungeons, or even if you don't do a Megadungeon, some of these ideas could help you in your campaign. So everyone, let's say goodbye to YouTube and happy holidays to YouTube. Although YouTube, it might not be the holidays, but in fact, it probably won't be. Bye. See you next time,
Bye.
YouTube.